This is a rare photo of me from 2013. It's the start of a new academic year, and I'm a Lib Dem. This was at their Winter Youth Conference of that year in Cardiff. Now, I will admit it does look typical enough, and it does reek of liberalism, but it actually hides a much darker subtext. We were arguing on a motion, we should ban rape jokes made in the party. I was part of the opposition. Should I really make a political journey video? Aren't they a bit too narcissistic and smug? Yeah. We still do them, though. As of July of this year, I am 25 years old. But for 19 of that, I never really was very politically active. If you had to label me as anything, I guess you could call me a Christian. Yeah, those were dark days. The last 6 years, however, look something a bit more like this. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to year 0. I don't think I'll ever know the exact reason that I got into politics, but it happened sometime around March 2013. How do I know this? Well, not too sure. But I did definitely say thinking about becoming a politician around the same time, so maybe. And just to give you a bit of perspective of my mindset at the time, here's another little quote I made a month later. Ooh. Probably helped that a few months prior I'd thrown away my religion of 18 years and was in the beginning of my Ditchkins phase, as all lonely younglings do, I suppose. Which at the time meant a good helping of the feminist debate, which was pre-Gamergate but still in the beginning phases of the Sarkeesian Chronicles. And oddly, and sadly enough, I feel it was this initial background that set the stage for me and how I would go about my politics for the next 2 years. You see, I was a centrist before it was cool. And seeing as my beliefs were firmly centre, I just figured there was only one party for the taking. Labour, Tory, same old story. That was good enough for me. And yeah, sure, everybody hated Nick Clegg, but he was really good in the 2010 debates, and that was enough for me. And come on, a guy could dream, you know? Or so I thought. We'll call this period the YA atheist centrist phase. Yes, I saw in myself the politician who didn't listen to dogma, agreed with true and honest principles, and would soon become Prime Minister, leading the country with a rational mind and conviction that was sorely needed. But I also noticed through canvassing and conversations with my friends that nobody really gave a shit. Probably had something to do with our great leader's legacy, but who's to say for sure? So towards the summer I didn't really have much to do, so I started joining groups on Facebook to keep my political studies happy. By the way, political groups on Facebook at that time might as well have been called UKIP official fan pages, because that's literally all they were. Conservatives jerking off about how wrong they are. But it was in this cesspool that I became more aware of people like Nigel Farage and Milton Friedman. I really didn't dig any of their ideas, but the former seemed full of a much-needed pizzazz. Even though I was hostile to him at the time, looking under every nook and cranny to find an argument against him, they just always felt incomplete. It was almost as if liberalism wasn't strong enough to counter this conservative demon. Yet I couldn't turn down his character. He had tons of it. This was also around the same time that I tried making videos on YouTube proper, not just Michael Bay sucks. I did the usual. Feminism sucks. Religion sucks. Skepticism rules, bitches. And now we're just about caught up with this photo, and yes, that's really what I was arguing against. High on Hitchens, defending the right to free speech. I also had a motion in there myself for the banning of circumcision. Sadly, it didn't pass. Probably had something to do with me. Now at this point I'd grown pretty much disillusioned with the Liberal Democrats anyway, and it only took one final huge Facebook group argument for me to say goodbye to the Liberals forever. These guys did not seem like the old school libbies I'd been hearing about online, like Friedman. His ideas were starting to sound really interesting now. By comparison to what everybody else had been feeding me, the general perception I had of the left, they seemed kinda radical. Perhaps if we were only to take on some of these ideas, we'd actually be getting somewhere, instead of the constant lefty liberal policies 24/7. Or so I thought. I still couldn't get my head around some of the stuff, though. After all, we have free healthcare in this country, and it's fine. Why are the Americans complaining about it so much? Nevertheless, him and Farage definitely got me thinking. So, I decided to become lightly classical liberal/libertarian-y. It was a bunch of different kinds of views, I suppose, but it was all pretty much the same. And later, I'd sign my soul away officially by voting UKIP in the EU elections. Yes, I was a classical liberal before it was cool. My friends, they found my views weird. It seemed like every month I'd just come up to them with some brand new bizarre concept. Like how we should not allow seatbelts because it'll make drivers more careful. Like that's the policy everybody's gripping for. And that all our problems can be blamed on the Federal Reserve banking system. Being British, they probably didn't even know what the Fed was. I was the supreme gentleman in this regard. Of course, I wasn't all that bad. I still hated the BNP, but more so I found them silly. It was after the EU elections, however, that I started moving towards my next political aside. I found that UKIP, in light of their success in the elections, decided to pacify some of their policies to reach a broader appeal, changing the 31% flat tax rate, something that I thought was good, into a more streamlined, mainstream, progressive tax bracket. It made me skeptical of politicians, and reaffirmed my opinion that, yeah, politics just cannot get shit done. They're always capitulating. So when the school year came to a close, I was back at home and alone for most of the day. I started going into overdrive. Within a month of solitude, regular politico researching, and vast arguing on Facebook groups, Reddit didn't exist to me. I was more or less happy at that point to call myself an anarcho-capitalist. I was confident now. It wasn't going to end badly. We don't need a health service. Most firefighters in America are voluntary. We don't need cops. Just private ones. I had also been making a blog that's since been deleted, but, good lord. Now, the quote-unquote big moment for me happened when I saw this crop up on my subscription feed. The Young Turks were talking about an interview with Adam Carolla. Never heard of the guy. And I don't really remember the dynamics of it that well, but something Turks good, something Carolla bad. And who were to respond but Stefan Molyneux? Oh yeah, I'd been watching him, by the way. He was God to me. And bear in mind, at the time we are talking, the Young Turks had only ever really received any backlash from fundamentalist Christians. Today, of course, that's a different story, but back then, I was stoked. But then I spied a little comment down below. Thunderfoot. Oh my god, he's found Stefan too. This is a remarkable occasion. Unfortunately, of course, he didn't share the same views that we did. So for the sake of it all, I decided to do a quick response to Thunderfoot's comment with a very basic understanding I had of Austrian economics. It blew up. Of course, I only had about 50 subscribers at the time, so blew up for me meant about 402 weeks. But either way, it blew up. And this led me to thinking, well, maybe I've got something here. Maybe I should start this for real. After all, there aren't many libertarians in the UK, maybe I can offer a different perspective. So without further ado, I chose my next challenger. Cameron Watt of Libertarian Socialist Rants and his video, 10 Capitalist Myths. And viscerally tore him apart. It was a huge success, gaining me 30 subscribers in less than a month. And when I returned to uni, I would continue this trend with regular videos for the rest of the year. And for that period, my politics remained largely the same. I would subscribe to Liberty Me, hosted by Jeffrey Tucker, read up a few more books on libertarian ethics and economic principles, become a mod for the most popular Facebook libertarian group. Again, Reddit didn't exist to me. And this would eventually culminate in me meeting up with 2 other libertarian dudes in a very awkward get-together. Ugh. And then I spied that Cameron had made another video about capitalism. Well, there's no time like the present. I had to rebuke this. Not with sources, of course, just with my supreme intellect. Now this one got a bit more traction and even a response from Cameron himself, and it invited a lot of people from the then embryonic left tube to come over to my channel and engage in a bit of light-hearted debate. And as I was there splurting my flawless logic, along came one little commenter who sent this penny-dropping remark. But employees can choose to reinvest their money back into the business. Why do they need a boss to do that for them? I really still remember the feeling that those words gave me. As soon as I was about to jump onto the keyboard and lay things out, I just couldn't respond. Everything I'd ever thought was all based around the idea that bosses are necessary. Socialism can only equal Stalin. Now I was being told some fairly obvious stuff that I had no answers for. I decided to just keep with my basic idea of natural hierarchy, and therefore a boss would always be the better fit. That and there are hardly any cooperatives, so obviously that's reason enough that capitalism is better. And maybe something economic calculation problem. Who knows? But whether I liked it or not, this was the beginning of a new awakening of sorts for me, and I began a path of gradual disillusionment. From then on, I really started picking up on strange views from the libertarian side that just kept on jerking me. Why were so many libertarians anti-abortion when we know the facts? Hell, even our ideology justified it. Why did I agree with these people on so many points? But then they always had to take it a little bit too far. Why was I seeing so many of these avatars in the comment sections? And why were so many ANCAPs trying to alter their principles so they could hate on black people and want borders? This was especially true when, after the death of Eric Garner, Molyneux tried to explain why his death was justified, because selling untaxed cigarettes whilst others have to sell taxed ones is an unfair advantage. Yeah, he was dead to me at that point. And even a pre-Nazi Christopher Cantwell later made a video where his guest was explaining how wrong Molyneux was. But Cantwell, he always seemed to lay back from his criticisms. I could just see in his eye that something wasn't right. See, even though I was a libertarian, I was never really aggressively racist or sexist. I just considered these views to be the best way forward for humanity, in the vein of Learn Liberty co-star Stephen Horowitz. My main push was that people who were leftist and believed in progressive reforms were just going at it the wrong way. As of such, I found myself in a weird crowd. A crowd that was full in contradictions, that would sometimes spill out of me. Come 2015, I got into a weird old argument with some of my housemates over, of all things, intellectual property rights. It resulted in them silencing me for about a week, which really made me overthink my attitude. I stopped making videos regularly for some time. This period was filled with regular grinds of bargaining. I was trying to reconcile my shortly held beliefs with all the contradictions I was discovering each and every day, and all the more understanding the nature of how capitalism really developed, the fuller legacy of the left at large, and indeed the emerging situation in Syria. I was at this time now watching the old guard of LeftTube, LSR, Anarcho-Pac, Black Rose, Mark McGowan, and a few others. I guess I just tried to look for anything to counter this, literally anything, clinging mostly to the ECP and Joey V. Though strangely at this time anyway, there was absolutely zero critiques of libertarian socialism from the libertarian perspective. It almost seemed like they didn't want to acknowledge that they existed. Still, despite all this, I would continue to make videos from the ANCAP side of stuff, and even entered into a few live discussions with the Libertarian Alliance, hosted at that time by the up-and-coming Keir Martland. Even though I still labelled as an ANCAP, it really wouldn't be the same. I was not confident, and I only argued with stuff that I knew I could justify. Then the final hammer throw came. Libertarianism just seemed so hollow and simplistic the more I began to view expansive theory. I began really looking deeper into the perspectives people spoke about, understanding ises and oughts. Why, if a beggar falls down on the road, the rising opinion on the net was one of explaining why it was, instead of pushing the idea that actually maybe society ought to do something about this. Why were libertarians just so hostile to the idea of actually pushing forward any conceivable progressive line? They all just reasserted the same old conjecture. There's no such thing as gay rights, homeless rights, women's rights, only human rights. At this point, it was clear. Anarcho-capitalism was too myopic, too short-sighted, and never answered the questions I wanted to know. Instead, like religion, just referring to half-answers and unseen, plausibly deniable miracles. So, after I got a bit more confident, I decided to swallow my sorrows, stop the internal arguing in my head, and give in. And on May the 1st, 2015, I made it official. I was now ready to call myself an anarcho-communist. This is something I'd later regret, but I'll come to this a bit later. Now, many are still quite confused as to why I changed so quickly from being right-wing to left-wing, as it seemed like a matter of just a few months. Well, as we can see, there was an ever-changing process behind all of it. Many more have also asked what folks could do who live in conservative families and how you might go about convincing them otherwise. As much as I'd love to say, yeah, here's the way, I honestly doubt I have the answers, because I consider myself an anomaly in some sense, and yet all too familiar in others. When you're a young dude of my demographics, politics doesn't really affect you. Obviously it does, but what I mean is that you're not the first on the butcher's list. You therefore have a lot of free time to scout out new stuff, adventure into the unknown. Folks like David Cameron, well, like I said, it's David Cameron. I don't care about them. They're just some shit generic politicians. What has a far greater impact on you are things like media, pop culture, the education system. These are all pressing things directed straight at you, and they all appear on the surface center-left. Of course, we know that's not true, but that's what you're getting. There is, however, only a certain amount of times that John Lennon can talk about love, or that a teacher can read off the syllabus before you notice there's something not particularly whole here, or that this whole shtick just isn't getting anything done. You look around searching for solutions, but the media has always presented Uncle Joe's face for you. And so for you, that's a no-go zone. This, therefore, makes you susceptible to boogeymen like cultural Marxism, because all the other paths have been blocked. And when you go down this rabbit hole, you now find that you need a political basis to lean on, because otherwise there's no backbone for you to stand. So what better one to go for, then, than mainstream economic theory, disguised with just enough plausible deniability to present itself to you as radical. Conservatism now felt like a welcome escape from the hustle and bustle of young people my age who all seem to be particularly naive. Paul Joseph Watson is the archetypal definition of this kind of person, who presents himself as the hip counterculture, but is in reality just throwing paper airplanes at a brick wall. But I was lucky. I was helped throughout my younger days through my strong interest in gathering knowledge. By the age of 15, I had basically renounced a huge amount of my previous conspiracy theory beliefs. Yes, I didn't talk about those. And I understood a lot better about the world because of that. Even when my politics were completely dire, I was keeping in constant pace with real skeptic channels like Miles Power. This kept reminding me of a good principle to hold: criticism and self-criticism. It allowed me to eventually discover the holes laden in this conservative mess. I just hadn't come across the economic principles yet. And my reassurance with this new libertarian socialism thing helped me find a new solution. So yeah, that's the mindset. And now I was a leftist. And a brave move at that, because at that time the right was at the peak of their classical liberal bandwagon roller coaster. It didn't faze me that much. I knew at this point that the right-wing views were very much so outdated. Yet they held so much appeal. It really didn't look good for LeftTube. As well as this, there was this annoying troll called Love, Life and Anarchy, who seemed to be steadily growing in popularity with some really good production values. Yeah, that's something I always remember of the right back in the day. They had really good production values. It's almost as if somebody's paying them. Come 2016, I started to get a bit more confident with my beliefs. I'd done some political work in the field for once, even helped out in discussion groups that reached over 150 people. I started being able to be much more sufficient in my arguments, and with the return of LSR, things looked really good. And then LSR got dogpiled, and things weren't looking so good. And then he got blanketed by Sargon and Black Pigeon. Christ, where were you, Sean? Then there came about another small awakening of sorts for me. I made a video called Welcome to Ancapistan, and it was there that I got my first formal introduction to several so-called tankies, i.e. defenders of the USSR, I guess, but there's no set-in-stone concrete definition. At first, I couldn't help but find it incredibly bizarre that they would ever want to oppose my notion to ridicule the Soviet Union of all things. Is this the hill you seek to die on? After all, I'd been utilizing the standard line. The USSR was terrible, millions and gazillions died, authoritarianism, yay for Spain, rah rah rah. But there were certain answers to my questions that came across fairly eye-opening. Gave me a bit more context to the scenarios instead of the usual Cold War propaganda. I did ask my friends for their perspective, yet upon further research it always seemed as though their answers were incomplete. For the most part, these questions didn't need to be answered for me just yet, so I put them on the back burner. Now I won't bore you with much more, go look it up for yourself. I made my magnum opus, spent the next few months making some higher octane quality videos, and all the while in deep reflection over my constantly adapting views. And then came sweet old 2017, and everything started to change, because it was at this moment when the riots started happening in DC that officially the left had entered public discourse. It was a rocky year. I made a video in defense of the rioters, which in hindsight is a bit lacking and far too fetishistic. But some might argue that that kind of confidence is what we needed at the time in this slew of conservative responders. Carl Benjamin was one of those responders. And well, even though I knew he was wrong, I noticed with him and other responders that I could never properly defend myself that well. I figured it was time that I really needed to start knuckling down and gaining more confidence to defend my positions properly. I did what I've been told to do for a while, Google Bookchin. Looking back on Bookchin, I can't help but always feel that part of the hullabaloo that attracted me and so many others is not because his ideas were great, so to speak, but because they allowed a sort of expansiveness that wasn't available in orthodox anarcho-communism. Things like dialectical naturalism provided a sort of formal structure that reinforced my beliefs, albeit not that much. But this understanding of dialectics introduced me further to a concept I'd been missing for some time, a more thorough and clear understanding of the materialist approach of Karl Marx. There was always a tugging in the back of my mind. Do I really love this stuff? Or am I just doing this because I'm scared? Because I'm a product of my society, and I had to go this way? If you remember, I eventually had a debate on capitalism versus socialism that I was woefully underprepared for. Part of the reason for this was because I only had 2 days' notice, but another reason was because I was bordering on two sides, and therefore I couldn't give a solid answer as to whether I opposed certain things, because I was still learning about them, and that's not really good for a debate. Ultimately, the Marxist perspective just seemed more and more compelling. It seemed far more grounded and really let me grasp the context of events that had previously befallen me. I didn't think any of these places were good. I didn't think any of these people were good. But I could sympathize with their history. There were sober senses to it all and less of a feeling of fear. Based on my experiences in anarchist groups, the general practicalities and the lack of historical record, contradictions, etc., I was losing my confidence on the subject. It's strange how when you first pick up the rope of leftism it always seems so straightforward and simple. It begins with just the main concept of cooperation and ownership. Then, as time goes on, you start having to find answers to the wider questions, the real reality in which you live, how this applies to the modern-day conditions. You begin to understand the concepts of Eurocentrism, capitalist encirclement, accumulation of resources, contradiction, and anti-imperialism.
How long did it take the Jews to get their own country? How long did it take the Germans to make Germany?
And look how well that worked out.
You don't know what it is not to have a home. That's why you European Reds don't get it. You say it's nothing, but you have a home to come back to. ETA, ANC, IRA, we all pretend we care about your international revolution, but we don't care. We want to be nations. Home is everything.
Before long, it's difficult to really articulate the pastiches of power and revolution, and you begin focusing upon the matter of conditions. I'd put away Marxism for too long as some kind of boogeyman, something inherited from my brief conservative hangover, I suppose. But unconsciously I must have noticed that I had been focusing more on this than anarchism anyway. Its structure as a constantly evolving science provided the confidence I needed to increase my understanding of the wider world. It also came to my attention that many of the folks from the old days, including the OG, had taken similar paths. At first I just figured, well, maybe I should just call myself a libertarian Marxist. But, as I had found out from my reasons for jumping into anarchism, picking a title because it feels appropriate was a lesson I had to learn not to do. So that's what I did. And that just about brings us up to today, really. Since then, it's pretty much all been the same, just reading and gathering more information and constantly adapting my views. I made this video in part for reference, in part for perspective. But another reason is because there are so many myths and falsehoods that seem to have emerged from the guy who apparently changes his views every week. We tend to think of political change as a linear process. First you were this, then you were that, then you moved on to another thing, but it's never really like that. I took turns and curves, went back on things, slowed down and sped up, as I guess we all do. I guess the main difference is that I was just a bit more public about it all. Continuity and rupture is the process of taking something forward and transcending from it simultaneously. I think when it comes down to it, this is the nature of how we go about our political beliefs. Nobody's is the same. We then take the lessons we learned along the way, and our concepts in the present are the result of our decisions in the past. It would be wrong of me to say that I don't have an ideology, because ultimately I do take sides. And whilst I do find myself leaning towards the Marxist-Leninist tradition these days, I've learned a lot from my journey, and I'm never entirely confident to say who I am. I always have continuing gripes, arguments, and contentions with my views. And from all this toing and froing, it's made me quite cynical and skeptical to everything. Constantly trying to noodle out the bullshit of my politics until it forms into a polished crap factory is a pretty dire result. Though when it comes down to it, I probably wouldn't have it any other way. Though for all that, this graph does miss out something. Probably the most significant political lesson in my life, and it came across quite recently through an unfortunate route. Anna Campbell, who I'd come to know from working at the anarchist bookshop in Bristol, was killed in Syria last year, where she had gone to fight with the Yipaj. This was a shock and very saddening for me, because I'd not even known she'd left and wondered why she wasn't coming back to the bookshop. Anna was also the first friend in my life that had been killed. That's where it really cemented it for me. Politics is serious. It's no longer a matter of just picking a label. When a revolution comes around, our friends are going to be dying on a weekly basis, and there isn't going to be enough time to squabble over theory and practice on Twitter, about how the future might view us, about whether or not something obeys the precise philosophy. We're going to have to keep fighting. And for that, we need to be prepared with the most effective forms of taking on our enemies, not just liking ideologies because we can. Sometimes in the heat of it all, I feel like, I know it's a cringe, Frodo, wishing I'd never gone into all this mess, but knowing that you can't stop. How could you when so many people are suffering in the world? But then I stop and think, wait, no, I'm not like Frodo. Because Frodo got involved through conditions that were out of his control. I got involved through my own devilish curiosity. That's two ways of getting into politics, and I think from experience it's clear which one holds the most potential. I have to picture myself in the position of being on the edge of it all, Like all those people in history who were faced with making those decisions. And I suppose, being the demographic that I am, it doesn't offer me much in terms of my perspective. We have a habit of calling these things our political journeys. For many of us, people like me, they're more so our political privileges.
White people in the West tend to pick up things and they bounce between ideologies. Oh, 1 week you're a Marxist-Leninist, next week you're a Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought, and then a year later you're an anarchist, and a year after that you're a left communist, and a year after that you're a Democrat. We can't afford that shit. We don't have time for playing. Alright? So, we pick up revolutionary theory and practice to liberate our people first and foremost. Because we can't just afford to go among our people with, nobody cares what Gonzalo said. Nobody cares what this person said if it is not applicable to our daily reality.